Hey y'all, Mysteries of the Unexplained, part 2 in the series. If you haven't seen the first video, go check it out. So, got the pipe here. Little Missouri Meerschaum. Actually, somebody commented in one of my earlier videos and told me that this is called a Rob Roy. So thank you, whoever commented on that and told me what model this was. I couldn't remember, I wasn't sure. I love this little Rob Roy pipe. Inside I got some Colt Blood Red Moon. It's a awesome cherry blend. Cherry chocolate. So when we left off, we were in the section coincidences. And coincidences are something that I always thought was really intriguing and interesting. You know, things happen and we see connections between them. Is it really something mysterious going on and some sort of force, you know, having a hand in our lives? Or is it just us being so smart that we see connections in everything? We can connect dots to things in our lives that really have nothing to do with each other. We just feel like there's a connection because we have so many webs of thought that go out, you know. I'm not sure. It could be like some things, it could be a little bit of both. Certainly thought-provoking, though. Some of the ones in here are intense. And I feel like we've all had little things like that happen in our lives, you know. So this first one, it's really cool, but I also picked it because it's got a little bit of pipe smoking in it. It's called On a Woodland Path. Eric W. Smith, a metallurgist with the English Steel Company, lived in a quiet suburb of Sheffield called Ecclesall. Behind his house were woods where people used to ride, and in the spring and summer it was Smith's habit to stroll there, enjoying the peace and quiet and collecting horse manure for his tomato plants. For this purpose he carried with him a small dustpan and an old oilcloth shopping bag. One day in the late 1950s, as he was quietly making his way along a woodland path, pausing now and then to scoop up some manure for his tomatoes, he saw a figure slowly approaching him along the path. A man whose progress was also interrupted by stooping and shoveling. Clearly, Smith thought, here was another man who appreciated the virtues of horse manure. Midway between the two men was a bench, and reaching it simultaneously they sat down. By a remarkable coincidence, the stranger was carrying an oilcloth bag identical to Smith's, as well as a little dustpan. Both men, it turned out, had gone to the woods to collect manure for their tomatoes. With a bond now established, Smith reached for his pipe and tobacco tin. The stranger also took out a pipe, and Smith offered him a fill of tobacco. No thanks, the stranger said. I have my own brand. He did. It was the same as Smith's. At this point, both men had the sense that something eerie was happening to them. My name's Smith, Smith said. So's mine, said the stranger. Eric Smith, said the first Smith. Me too, said the second Smith. Eric W. Smith. Yes. The W stands for Wells, said number 1 Smith. Ah, said number 2. There we differ. I'm Walter. That's a first-hand report to the editors. Okay, so this next little nugget in coincidences talks about Lincoln and Kennedy, two presidents, two United States presidents that were assassinated, and the links between them. Very, very interesting, I feel like. Lincoln and Kennedy. Two of the most tragic and dramatic deaths in American history, the assassinations of Presidents Abraham Lincoln and John Fitzgerald Kennedy, involved the following astonishing parallels. 1. Lincoln was elected president in 1860. Exactly 100 years later, in 1960, Kennedy was elected president. 2. Both men were deeply involved in civil rights for Negroes. 3. Both men were assassinated on a Friday in the presence of their wives. 4. Each wife had lost a son while living at the White House. 5. Both men were killed by a bullet that entered the head from behind. 6. Lincoln was killed in Ford's Theater. Kennedy met his death while riding in a Lincoln convertible made by the Ford Motor Company. 7. Both men were succeeded by vice presidents named Johnson, who were Southern Democrats and former senators. 8. Andrew Johnson was born in 1808. Lyndon Johnson was born in 1908, exactly 100 years later. 9. The first name of Lincoln's private secretary was John. The last name of Kennedy's private secretary was Lincoln. 10. John Wilkes Booth was born in 1839, according to some sources. Lee Harvey Oswald was born in 1939, 100 years later. Those are the assassins. 11. Both assassins were Southerners who held extremist views. 12. Both assassins were murdered before they could be brought to trial. 13. Booth shot Lincoln in a theater and fled to a barn. Oswald shot Kennedy from a warehouse and fled to a theater. 14. Lincoln and Kennedy each has 7 letters. 15. Andrew Johnson and Lyndon Johnson each has 13 letters. 16. John Wilkes Booth and Lee Harvey Oswald each has 15 letters. In addition, the first public proposal that Lincoln be the Republican candidate for president in a letter to the Cincinnati Gazette, November 6, 1858, also endorsed a John Kennedy for vice president, John P. Kennedy, formerly Secretary of the Navy. That's from The Incredible Dr. Matrix by Martin Gardner, pages 42 through 45. And I almost feel like those similarities are just too striking to ignore. All right. Give this a tamp here. All right. This is going to be the last little nugget on coincidences. And this involves an object. It's called clocking out. An ornate clock belonging to King Louis XIV of France stopped at the precise moment of his death, 7:45 a.m. on September 1st, 1715, and has never run since. That's from Ripley's giant book of Believe It or Not. Strange. So here's one more. The bullet that found its mark. In 1883, Henry Ziegler of Honeygrove, Texas, jilted his sweetheart, who then killed herself. Her brother tried to avenge her by shooting Ziegler, but the bullet only grazed his face and buried itself in a tree. The brother, believing that he had killed Ziegler, then took his own life. In 1913, Ziegler was cutting down the tree with the bullet in it. It was a difficult job, so he used dynamite. The explosion sent the old bullet through Ziegler's head and killed him. That's from Ripley's Believe It or Not, page 133. Yeah, this Colt Blood Red Moon is the best cherry blend I've ever had. I haven't had a whole lot. This was probably the second or third one I had. I just stopped here. Okay. So now we're moving into a new section. This section is titled Unearthly Fates. The first part of this section is called Spontaneous Human Combustion. Fascinating subject. Okay, first one. On Christmas Eve, 1885, near Ottawa, Illinois, Mr. and Miss Patrick Rooney, their son John, and their hired hand, John Larson, sat around the kitchen table celebrating the holiday with a jug of whiskey Farmer Rooney had just brought back from town. Larson had a few drinks and went off to bed. John Rooney stayed for a while, but eventually left for his farm a mile away. Larson, rising early, came down Christmas morning to do his chores. He tried to strike a match on the iron kitchen stove, but found to his surprise that the stove was covered with a layer of greasy soot. Alarmed, he quickly struck the match against his thumbnail and lit the lamp. To his horror, he saw Patrick Rooney sitting dead in a chair. There was no sign of Mrs. Rooney. Larson rushed out, saddled a horse, and galloped madly to John Rooney's farm. When Larson and young Rooney got back, they found what remained of Mrs. Rooney under a 3-by-4-foot hole in the floor. On the bare ground, a couple of feet below, were a burned piece of skull, 2 charred vertebrae, a foot, and a small pile of ashes, all that remained of the 200-pound woman. No other part of the floor was burned, and neither was any of the furniture. The only damaged item was the corner of the tablecloth hanging over the hole, which was slightly scorched. The police were summoned. They found that the soot drifting upstairs had outlined Larson's head on the pillow while he slept. Although suspicion fell on Larson, no case could be made against him. The coroner, Dr. Floyd Clemens, pointed out to the bewildered jury that this was a classic instance of spontaneous combustion, a body consumed by intense heat in the absence of any kind of fire. The jury, however, could not reach a verdict on the cause of Mrs. Rooney's death other than calling it accidental, but the cause of her husband's death was quite clear. He had been asphyxiated by the fumes of his wife's burning body. There's a few citations here. Mysterious Fires and Lights by Vincent H. Gaddis, pages 217 and 218. Fire from Heaven, A Study of Spontaneous Combustion in Human Beings, Michael Harrison. And that's pages 79 and 80. And then Pursuit, which would be a magazine, fall 1976. And then True, which would be another magazine, May 1964, page 33. Okay, now this next one is a pretty famous case of spontaneous combustion. And there's actually a pretty terrible photo that goes with this one, but it's not. This book doesn't contain it. I've seen it, and you could probably find it online, but there's a real, just horrible photo of this, from this case. This is the 1951 death of Mary Reeser. Of St. Petersburg, Florida. She was found reduced to ashes in a practically undamaged apartment, was a landmark case of spontaneous combustion because it was the first instance where every possible tool of modern scientific investigation was used to determine the cause of this mysterious phenomenon. Yet, despite the efforts of the FBI, fire officials, arson experts, and pathologists, a year after the incident, Detective Cass Burgess of the St. Petersburg Police commented as follows: "Our investigation has turned up nothing that could be singled out as proving beyond a doubt what actually happened. The case is still open. We are still as far from establishing any logical cause for the death as we were when we first entered Miss Reeser's apartment." To which Police Chief J.R. Reichert added, "As far as logical explanations go, this is one of those things that just couldn't have happened, but it did. The case is not closed and may never be to the satisfaction of all concerned." And Dr. Wilton M. Krogman, a physical anthropologist at the University of Pennsylvania's School of Medicine and a world-renowned expert on the effects of fire on the human body, finally gave up trying to understand what had happened. Dr. Krogman said, "I regard it as the most amazing thing I have ever seen. As I review it, the short hairs on my neck bristle with vague fear. Were I living in the Middle Ages, I'd mutter something about black magic." This one's long, so here are the details of the case. Mrs. Mary Hardy Reeser, an agreeable, motherly widow of 67, was living in St. Petersburg, Florida, to be near her son, Dr. Richard Reeser. On the evening of July 1st, 1951, she had remained in her son's home with one of her grandchildren while the rest of the family went to the beach. When they returned, they found that Mrs. Reeser had already left for her own apartment. The younger Mrs. Reeser drove to her mother-in-law's to see if everything was all right. According to her testimony, there was nothing in Mrs. Mary Reeser's appearance or demeanor to cause any alarm. Dr. Reeser visited his mother later that evening. She was mildly depressed over the fact that she had not heard from two friends who were supposed to rent an apartment for her in anticipation of a return trip to Columbia, Pennsylvania, formerly her hometown. His mother told him that she wished to retire early and would take 2 sleeping pills to ensure a good night's rest. Dr. Reeser left at about 8:30 p.m. and returned to his home. The last person to see Mrs. Reeser alive was her landlady, Mrs. Pansy M. Carpenter, who lived in another apartment in the 4-unit building. The 2 units between them were unoccupied. Mrs. Carpenter saw Mrs. Reeser briefly at about 9 p.m. She was wearing her nightgown, a housecoat, and black satin slippers and was lounging in a comfortable chair smoking a cigarette. The bed covers had been turned back. Miss Reeser's last night was a typical summer night in Florida. The sky was overcast with occasional flashes of heat lightning in the distance. When Miss Carpenter woke up Monday morning at 5 a.m., she noticed a slight odor of smoke but was not alarmed, since she attributed the smell to a water pump in the garage that had been overheating lately. She got up, turned off the pump, and settled back into bed. When she got up an hour later to collect her newspaper outside, she no longer smelled any smoke. At 8 a.m., a telegram arrived from Miss Reeser. Mrs. Carpenter signed the receipt and went to her tenant's apartment to bring her the telegram. The doorknob, when she placed her hand on it, was hot. Alarmed, she stepped back and shouted for help. 2 painters working across the street ran over. One of them opened the door. As he entered, he felt a blast of hot air. Thinking of rescuing Mrs. Reeser, he frantically looked around but saw no signs of her. The bed was empty. There was some smoke, but the only fire was a small flame on a wooden beam over a partition separating the living room and kitchenette. The firemen arrived, put out the small flame with a hand pump, and tore away part of the partition. When Assistant Fire Chief S.O. Griffith began his inspection of the premises, he could not believe his eyes. In the middle of the floor, there was a charred area roughly 4 feet in diameter, inside which he found a number of blackened chair springs and the ghastly remains of a human body, consisting of a charred liver attached to a piece of spine, a shrunken skull, 1 foot still wearing a black satin slipper, and a small pile of ashes. Coroner Edward T. Silk arrived to examine the body and survey the apartment. Although deeply puzzled, he decided that the death was accidental and authorized the removal of the remains. The scooped-up ashes, the tiny shrunken head, and the slipper-encased foot were taken by ambulance to a local hospital. The ensuing investigation included police and fire officials as well as arson experts. The facts that confronted them seemed inexplicable considering the great heat necessary to account for Miss Reeser's incinerated body. Little of the furniture, other than the chair and the end table next to it, was badly damaged, but the apartment had suffered some peculiar effects. The ceiling, draperies, and walls, from a point exactly 4 feet above the floor, were coated with a smelly, oily soot. Below this 4-foot mark, there was none. The wall paint adjacent to the chair was faintly brown, but the carpet where the chair had rested was not even burned through. A wall mirror 10 feet away had cracked, probably from heat. On a dressing table 12 feet away, 2 pink wax candles had puddled, but their wicks lay undamaged in their holders. Plastic wall outlets above the 4-foot mark were melted, but the fuses were not blown and the current was on. The baseboard electrical outlets were undamaged. An electric clock plugged into one of the fused fixtures had stopped at precisely 4:20, but the same clock ran perfectly when plugged into one of the baseboard outlets. Newspapers nearby on a table and draperies and linens on the daybed close at hand, all flammable, were not damaged. And though the painters and Miss Carpenter had felt a wave of heat when they opened the door, no one had noted smoke or burning odor, and there were no embers or flames in the ashes. Faced with such a mystery, the St. Petersburg authorities called in the FBI. Laboratory findings showed that Mrs. Reeser's estimated weight of 175 pounds had been reduced to a total of less than 10 pounds, including the foot and shrunken head. The final report concluded that no known chemical agents or other accelerants had been involved in starting the fire, and ended by stating that the case was unusual and improbable. A top arson expert of the National Board of Underwriters was also stumped. "I can only say," he admitted, "the victim died from fire." Finally, the aforementioned Dr. Krogman, an authority on different kinds of burns, was asked to help clarify the mystery. After checking the findings of the other authorities, he began eliminating possibilities. He considered lightning as a cause, but an engineer who specialized in the effects of lightning bolts on the human body flatly dismissed such a conjecture. Besides, lightning was not reported in the immediate neighborhood during the night of the accident. Another possibility was that the sedatives taken by Miss Reeser had made her so drowsy that she did not notice a fire set to her nightgown or chair by the cigarette she was smoking. However, neither the gown nor the chair was particularly flammable, and besides, there was not enough material available in these items to produce the intense heat necessary to reduce a human body to ashes. Dr. Krogman had burned cadavers with gasoline, oil, wood, and all kinds of other agents. He has experimented with bones encased in flesh or stripped, both moist and dry. His tests have utilized combustion apparatus ranging from outdoor pyres to the most modern pressurized crematorium equipment. He has demonstrated conclusively that it takes enormous heat to consume a body, and that only at over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit would bone become volatile enough to lose its shape and leave only ashes. "These are very great heats," he said, "that would sear, char, scorch, or otherwise mar or affect anything and everything within a considerable radius. They say truth is often stranger than fiction, and this case proves it." The remaining slippered left foot was a mystery in itself. It was established that Mrs. Reeser was in the habit of stretching out her left leg because of some physical discomfort in that limb. The foot was left unburned, apparently because it was outside the mysterious 4-foot radius of incineration. Another speculation, that the fire might have been caused by some failure in the electrical system, was also ruled out by the experts. The fuse would have blown. Finally, murder and suicide were considered. Murder was eliminated because there was no known suspects. The apartment had not been disturbed, and there was no hypothesis to account for how such a murder could have been accomplished. Suicide, too, was ruled out. Mrs. Reeser was well provided for and not depressed, and again, How could she have set such a fire? Eventually, Dr. Krogman admitted defeat. He reported to Chief Rackart, "I have posed the problem to myself again and again of why Mrs. Reeser could have been so thoroughly destroyed, even to the bones, and yet leave nearby objects materially unaffected. I always end up rejecting it in theory, but facing it in apparent fact." Nor could he understand the shrunken condition of Miss Reeser's skull. The head is not left complete in ordinary burning cases. Certainly it does not shrivel or symmetrically reduce to a much smaller size. In presence of heat sufficient to destroy soft tissues, the skull would literally explode in many pieces. I have never known any exception to this rule. Never have I seen a skull so shrunken or a body so completely consumed by heat. Okay, so that's Mysterious Fires and Lights, Vincent H. Gaddish, page 246 through 59. Fire from Heaven, A Study of Spontaneous Combustion in Human Beings, from Michael Harrison, pages 120 through 136. The Mysterious World, An Atlas of the Unexplained, Francis Hitching, page 21. True, May 1964, pages 32, 106, 07, and 112. Okay. So one more on spontaneous human combustion. I picked this one because it mentions a pipe. The burned body of Alan M. Small, age 52, was found in his home at Deer Isle, Maine on January 13, 1943. The carpet beneath his body was scorched, but there was no other sign of fire anywhere in the house. In the kitchen, the stove lids were all in place, and Small's unlit pipe was resting on a shelf. That's from Mysterious Fires and Lights, Vincent H. Gaddis, page 227. Well, I think that's going to do it for Mysteries of the Unexplained. I'll go ahead and tell y'all where we're going to be going next time. So, we're still going to be in Unearthly Fates. Next time we're going to be going through inexplicable crimes and assaults, appearances and disappearances. Thank y'all for watching.